The first sign of trouble came through the quantum sensors of the hegemony battleship Eternal Dominion. Admiral Vextar's 4 eyes narrowed as he studied the readout, his chitinous exoskeleton clicking against his command chair. Something was wrong with the sensor data. It showed a single vessel approaching their patrol zone, but the energy signature was unlike anything in the known database. Tactical, report, Vextar commanded, his voice a low rumble that made lesser crew members instinctively step back. The hegemony had ruled this sector of space for over 2 millennia, and nothing moved here without their permission. Lieutenant Zephyr, a nervous Kytherian with pale blue skin and too many fingers, bent over his console. Sir, we have one unidentified vessel, approximate length 400 meters. Configuration unknown. They're not responding to our hails. Size. Admiral Vextar's mandibles clicked together impatiently. That's the strange part, sir. For a ship that's small, their power output is significant, almost as much as a heavy cruiser. Admiral Vextar stood from his throne-like command chair, his massive form casting a shadow across the bridge. The Eternal Dominion was a hegemony dreadnought, one of 12 that patrolled the outer reaches of their territory. At 3 kilometers long and bristling with enough firepower to reduce a moon to asteroids, it had never encountered an opponent it couldn't crush. Communications, open a channel, Vextar ordered. Unknown vessel. This is Admiral Vextar of the hegemony dreadnought Eternal Dominion. You are entering restricted space. Identify yourself immediately or be destroyed. The response came not through normal communication channels, but through an encrypted quantum burst that somehow bypassed all their security protocols. When the translation matrix finally processed it, the bridge fell silent. This is Captain Sarah Chun of the Earth vessel Indomitable. We are not seeking conflict, but we will not be threatened. We request safe passage through this system to continue our mission. Admiral Vextar's compound eyes widened. Earth. That name meant nothing to him, but the translation matrix indicated it was the designation of a planet. A single planet daring to challenge the might of the hegemony. Tactical analysis, he barked. Lieutenant Zephok's fingers danced over his console, and the main screen filled with data. The unknown ship appeared to be constructed from some kind of advanced composite material that their sensors could barely penetrate. Its design was strange, angular, and aggressive, with what looked like weapons ports scattered across its hull in seemingly random patterns. Sir, Zephok's voice cracked slightly. Their ship appears to be heavily damaged. Hull breaches sealed with what looks like emergency patches, burn marks across multiple surfaces, and yet their weapon systems appear to be at full operational status. They've been in battle recently. Observed Commander Krillvass, the ship's second-in-command. His reptilian features showed concern. What kind of enemy leaves a ship that damaged, but still functioning? Admiral Vextar's mind raced through possibilities. In all his centuries of service, he had never encountered a species willing to continue fighting with such extensive damage. Most civilized races would have retreated or surrendered long before their vessels reached such a state. Unknown vessel Indomitable, he transmitted again. You will power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded for inspection. This is your final warning. The reply came immediately, and this time Admiral Vextar noticed something that made his blood run cold. The human's voice was calm, almost conversational, despite being outnumbered and outgunned by a factor of thousands. Admiral, I'm going to explain something to you because I believe in giving people fair warning. We humans have a saying, never corner something nastier than you. Right now, you have 3 options. 1, you can let us pass peacefully. 2, you can try to stop us and learn why that's a bad idea. Or 3, you can call for backup first and then try to stop us. Sir, whispered Commander Krillvass, is she threatening us? Admiral Vextar couldn't believe what he was hearing. A single ship, already battle-damaged, was not only refusing to surrender, but actually suggesting he needed reinforcements. It was either incredible arrogance or communication breakdown, he muttered to himself. She must not understand our capabilities. Show them our strength, Commander. Power up all weapon systems and lock target. The Eternal Dominion's massive weapons began to charge with an ominous hum that resonated through the ship's hull. Plasma cannons capable of melting through asteroid belts swiveled toward the small human vessel. Ion beam arrays that could cripple a fleet powered up with crackling energy. The ship's primary spinal weapon, a quantum disruptor cannon that could shatter planets, began its charging cycle. Energy spike detected from the human vessel, Lieutenant Zephoke reported, his voice tight with anxiety. They're not powering weapons, sir. They're doing something to their engines. On the tactical display, the human ship began to move, but not in any pattern Admiral Vextar had seen before. Instead of trying to escape or taking a defensive position, the Indomitable began to accelerate directly toward them. Impossible, commandant Krivai said. No ship that size could achieve those acceleration rates without liquefying its crew. But the human ship continued to accelerate, pulling maneuvers that should have been physically impossible for any living crew to survive. It wasn't following standard combat patterns or retreat protocols. It was doing something Admiral Vextar had never seen in 3 centuries of warfare. It was attacking. Sir, Lieutenant Zephoke's voice was now openly panicked. They're launching something. Multiple objects, small, fast-moving. Point defense systems. Intercept those missiles, Admiral Vextar commanded. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized something was wrong. The objects weren't following predictable missile trajectories. They were moving in complex patterns, almost like they were thinking. They're not missiles, sir, Zephoke reported. They appear to be drones, autonomous hunter-killers, and they're more launching every second. Admiral Vextar watched in growing alarm as dozens, then hundreds of small objects swarmed from the human ship. Each one seemed to be independently guided, weaving between the Eternal Dominion S-point defense fire with impossible agility. How many crew does that ship carry? He demanded. Based on its size, no more than 50, perhaps 100 at most, Commander Krillvas replied. Then, how are they controlling so many independent units? Before anyone could answer, the first wave of human drones reached the Eternal Dominion's outer hull. Instead of exploding, they attached themselves to specific points and began cutting through the armor with focused energy beams. Hull breach in sections 12 through 18, came the report from damage control. They're targeting our sensor arrays and communication relays. Admiral Vextar realized with growing horror that the humans weren't trying to destroy his ship outright. They were systematically dismantling its ability to coordinate with other hegemony forces. They were isolating the Eternal Dominion before moving in for the kill. All batteries, fire at will, he commanded. Destroy that ship now. The Eternal Dominion unleashed its full fury. Plasma bolts large enough to vaporize city blocks streaked toward the human vessel. Ion beams that could disable a fleet converged on its position. The quantum disruptor cannon fired with enough force to crack a moon. But the human ship wasn't there anymore. Where did it go? Admiral Vextar demanded. Sir, it appears to have used some kind of micro-jump drive, Lieutenant Zephoke stammered. They're now positioned directly beneath us, in our blind spot. The Indomitable had somehow folded space around itself, jumping just a few thousand kilometers to a position no hegemony captain had ever considered vulnerable. It was a tactic so insane, so dangerous, that no rational being would attempt it. No civilization uses micro-jumps in combat, Commander Krillvas said incredulously. The risk of materialization failure, the power requirements, the navigation complexity, it's suicide. Unless, Admiral Vextar said quietly, you're dealing with a species that considers suicide an acceptable tactical option. The human ship began firing. But these weren't the massive energy weapons Admiral Vextar expected. Instead, the Indomitable launched a barrage of what appeared to be simple kinetic projectiles. Chunks of metal accelerated to incredible velocities, striking the Eternal Dominion's hull with devastating precision. Damage report, Admiral Vextar demanded as a ship shuddered under the impact. Sir, they're using depleted uranium projectiles accelerated to approximately 15% of light speed, came the shocked reply. The kinetic energy alone is equivalent to antimatter warheads. How are they achieving those velocities with such primitive weapons? Admiral Vextar didn't have an answer. The humans were fighting with weapons that by all rights should have been obsolete, but they were using them in ways that defied conventional tactical wisdom. Their entire approach to warfare seemed built around principles no civilized species would accept. "Sir," Lieutenant Zefake called out urgently, "I'm detecting massive energy spikes from their vessel. They're charging something big." On the main screen, the human ship began to glow with an ominous light. Power readings climbed far beyond what should have been possible for a vessel of its size. "What's their reactor output?" Admiral Vextar asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Sir, based on these readings, I believe they're running their reactor beyond safe parameters." "Far beyond." "They're essentially creating a controlled fusion explosion and channeling it directly into their weapons systems." "That's insane," Commander Krillvas whispered. "One containment failure, and they'll vaporize themselves." Admiral Vextar stared at the tactical display, finally beginning to understand what they were facing. The humans weren't just willing to die for their cause. They were eager to take their enemies with them. Every tactical decision they made assumed acceptable losses that no other species would tolerate. "All ships," he broadcast on the emergency frequency. "This is Admiral Vextar. We have encountered an unknown hostile species. Recommend immediate fleet response. These beings are—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Unlike anything we have previously cataloged." The response from Fleet Command was swift and predictable. "Admiral, you command a dreadnought. What possible threat could a single unknown vessel pose?" Admiral Vextar looked at his tactical display, where hundreds of human drones continued to systematically dismantle his ship's defensive systems, while their mothership charged weapons that could theoretically destroy them both. "Fleet Command," he said quietly, "recommend you scramble everything we have, and send word to the Council." "Admiral, that seems like an overreaction to a single. They're not fighting to win," Admiral Vextar interrupted, his voice filled with a growing dread. "They're fighting to ensure we lose. There's a difference, and it's more terrifying than you can imagine." As if to punctuate his words, the human ship fired its overcharged weapon directly into the heart of his vessel, and Admiral Vextar realized that everything the hegemony thought they knew about warfare was about to change forever. The emergency transmission from Admiral Vextar reached the hegemony high command exactly 14 minutes before his ship's destruction. Fleet Admiral Kalmek, a massive hegemony warlord whose species had conquered 17 star systems, read the report with growing disbelief from his command center aboard the fortress station Iron Fist. "A single vessel destroyed the Eternal Dominion?" he asked his aide, Commander Silten, whose pale yellow exoskeleton trembled slightly as she nodded confirmation. "Yes, sir." The transmission logs show Admiral Vextar's vessel was systematically disabled before the final detonation. Fleet Admiral Kalmek studied the tactical data streaming in from automated sensor buoys scattered throughout the sector. The information painted an impossible picture. The human vessel had not only destroyed a hegemony dreadnought, but had done so using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. "They used their own ship as a missile," Commander Silten reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "After crippling the Eternal Dominion, they overloaded their reactor and rammed it directly into the command section. Both vessels were completely destroyed." "Suicide attack," Fleet Admiral Kalmek mused, his multiple eyes focusing on different aspects of the data simultaneously. "But why sacrifice their ship to destroy just one of ours? The tactical exchange ratio makes no sense." What Fleet Admiral Kalmek didn't understand was that Captain Sarachun had never intended the Indomitable to survive. The human vessel had been damaged beyond repair in their previous engagement with an unknown alien force 3 systems away. Rather than abandon their ship or attempt futile repairs, the crew had voted unanimously to use their vessel's destruction as a weapon. The implications of this tactical philosophy would not become clear to the hegemony leadership for several more hours. Across the galaxy, news of the incident spread through official channels with typical bureaucratic slowness. But in the shadow networks used by pirates, smugglers, and information brokers, word traveled much faster. Within 6 hours, every major criminal organization in 3 sectors knew that someone had successfully destroyed a hegemony dreadnought. Captain Rex Voidhart, leader of the infamous Crimson Nebula pirate fleet, received the news while his ships were hiding in the asteroid belt of the Kronos system. A scarred veteran of dozens of battles with hegemony forces, Rex had spent the last 20 years avoiding direct confrontation with their heavy warships. "Boss," his first mate Kira said as she entered his private quarters, You need to see this intelligence report we intercepted. Rex read through the data twice before looking up at his crew. This has to be some kind of mistake. Nobody rams a dreadnought. That's not tactics, that's madness. Unless, suggested his weapons officer, a cybernetically enhanced human named Marcus Cole. It's not madness to them. Rex paused, studying Marcus with interest. The man was one of only 3 humans in his crew, refugees from a colony ship that had been destroyed by hegemony forces 5 years earlier. Unlike the other species that made up his pirate fleet, the humans had a reputation for taking risks that bordered on the suicidal. What do you mean by that? Rex asked. Marcus leaned forward, his mechanical eye focusing intently on his captain. Back on Earth, we had a phrase, acceptable losses. Most species seem to think in terms of minimizing casualties. Humans think in terms of maximizing damage to the enemy, even if it costs us everything. That's not strategy, Kira protested. That's just throwing lives away. Is it? Marcus countered. If one human ship can take out a hegemony dreadnought, and if they're willing to make that trade every time, how many dreadnoughts does the hegemony actually have? The question hung in the air as Rex's crew considered the implications. The hegemony's power was built on the assumption that their massive ships were too valuable to risk in anything but overwhelming force. If someone was willing to trade smaller ships for larger ones without regard for crew survival, the mathematics of galactic warfare would shift dramatically. Meanwhile, in the hegemony capital system of Dominax Prime, the High Council was convening an emergency session. The council chamber, a massive crystalline dome that could hold representatives from 1,000 worlds, buzzed with nervous energy as news of the dreadnought's destruction spread. Councillor Velthane, the elected representative of the hegemony's founding species, called for order with a deep harmonic tone that resonated through the chamber. We are here to address the destruction of the Eternal Dominion and the implications of this unprecedented attack. Unprecedented, challenged Councillor Morgex, whose species had joined the hegemony only 50 years earlier. It was a single ship. We lose vessels to accidents, system failures, and even occasional pirate attacks. Why is this different? Admiral Kalmek rose from his position in the military section of the chamber. Because, honored counselor, this was not an accident or a pirate raid. This was a deliberate tactical decision by an unknown species to sacrifice their own vessel in order to eliminate one of our primary combat assets. The implications for our defense strategy are significant. You're talking about one ship, Councillor Morgex insisted. Even if they have a fleet of these vessels, our numerical superiority is overwhelming. We operate 1,200 dreadnoughts across our territory. And how many ships are they willing to lose to destroy them? Admiral Kalmek asked quietly. The question created an uncomfortable silence in the chamber. The hegemony's military doctrine was built around the principle of overwhelming force, achieving quick victory with minimal casualties to their own forces. The idea of an enemy willing to accept massive losses to inflict damage was outside their strategic framework. Councillor Velthane activated the chamber's main display, showing a tactical map of the known galaxy. What do we know about this human species? Where are they from? What are their capabilities? Very little, Admiral Kalmek admitted. The ship that destroyed the Eternal Dominion appeared to be heavily damaged from a previous engagement. Our analysis suggests they've been fighting someone else before encountering our forces. Their technology appears to be a mixture of advanced and primitive systems, combined in ways that don't match any known technological development pattern. Could they be refugees? Asked Councillor Zarveth, whose species had joined the hegemony seeking protection from a hostile neighbor. Perhaps they're fleeing from some other threat? Possibly, Admiral Kalmek replied. But if so, they're refugees who consider mutual destruction an acceptable tactical option. That makes them potentially more dangerous than whatever they're running from. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Spymaster Nex Allen, the hegemony's chief intelligence officer. Her species, the shadow-dwelling Umbrals, were natural information gatherers, and her presence in the council chamber meant the situation was serious enough to require her personal attention. Honored counselors, Nex Allen said, her voice carrying the characteristic multi-tonal harmonics of her species, we have received additional intelligence regarding this human species. She activated a holographic display that showed the intercepted communications from various pirate and smuggler networks. In the 6 hours since the incident, News of the Dreadnought's destruction has spread throughout the criminal underworld. More concerning, we're detecting increased communication traffic between previously unconnected pirate groups. What kind of communications? Counselor Velthane asked. They appear to be sharing tactical data about our ship movements and discussing coordination opportunities. Admiral Kalmek felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. The hegemony's control over their territory depended partly on keeping criminal organizations fragmented and competitive. If the various pirate fleets began working together, the security implications would be severe. There's more, Spymaster Nex Allen continued. We've intercepted communications suggesting that several pirate leaders are actively seeking contact with this human ship. The ship was destroyed, Counselor Morgex pointed out. That ship was destroyed, Nex Allen corrected. But our analysis of the debris field suggests their technology base is too sophisticated to represent a single vessel. The humans appear to have access to manufacturing capabilities and resource bases we have not yet identified. Admiral Kalmek stood again, his massive form casting a shadow across the chamber floor. Honored counselors, I recommend we shift from reactive to proactive measures. We need to locate the source of these human vessels and neutralize the threat before it can spread. How do you neutralize an enemy that considers dying an acceptable tactic? Counselor Zarveth asked. The question echoed through the chamber, and Admiral Kalmek realized he didn't have a good answer. Every military strategy he knew was based on the assumption that the enemy wanted to survive. How do you fight someone who doesn't share that basic assumption? We need more information, Spymaster Nex Allen said. I recommend deploying scout ships to backtrack the human vessel's approach vector. We need to understand where they came from and what their capabilities are. And if we encounter more of their ships? Admiral Kalmek asked. We observe from a distance and avoid engagement until we understand their tactical doctrine. Counselor Velthane considered the options before addressing the chamber. Very well. Admiral, deploy scout ships to investigate. Spymaster, increase surveillance on criminal networks and monitor for any signs of human contact. All fleet commanders are to avoid engagement with unknown vessels matching the profile of the destroyed ship unless absolutely necessary for self-defense. As the council session concluded and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Admiral Kalmek remained behind to study the tactical data one more time. Something about the human attack pattern bothered him, something beyond the obvious suicide tactics. Commander Silten, he called to his aide, analyzed the human ship's weapons performance again. Focus on accuracy and target selection. Minutes later, Commander Silten returned with a troubled expression. Sir, their targeting was surgical. Despite using kinetic weapons and suffering battle damage, they hit critical systems with near-perfect accuracy. They weren't just destroying the Eternal Dominion. They were specifically disabling its ability to call for help or coordinate with other ships. So they isolated their target before destroying it, Admiral Kalmek mused. Yes, sir. And sir, the timing of their final attack suggests they waited until they were certain the Eternal Dominion had transmitted details about their capabilities to Fleet Command. Admiral Kalmek's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. They wanted us to know what they were capable of. It appears so, sir. The Admiral stared at the tactical display. Finally, understanding that the destruction of the Eternal Dominion hadn't been a desperate last stand by a damaged ship. It had been a message, carefully crafted and deliberately transmitted. The humans weren't just fighting the hegemony. They were teaching them to be afraid. And across the galaxy, in hidden bases and secret communications networks, that message was being received exactly as intended. The hegemony could be hurt. Their dreadnoughts could be destroyed. And somewhere out in the void, there was a species crazy enough to prove it. The word was spreading, and with it, the first cracks began to appear in an empire that had stood for 3,000 years. 3 days after the destruction of the Eternal Dominion, Hegemony scout ship Silent Observer emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, following the reverse trajectory of the human vessel. Commander Yildash, a veteran intelligence officer with over 2 centuries of experience, had volunteered for this mission specifically because her species, the Seekers, possessed natural abilities that made them ideal for reconnaissance work. Initial scan complete, reported her pilot, Lieutenant Kexvor. System contains 7 planets, 2 gas giants, and an extensive asteroid field. No immediate signs of large-scale industrial activity. Commander Yildash studied the sensor data with her enhanced optical organs, capable of detecting electromagnetic signatures across 17 different spectrums. Something was wrong with the readings. The system appeared empty, but the quantum resonance patterns suggested recent high-energy activities. "Take us deeper into the system," she ordered. "Maintain stealth protocols. If there are humans here, I want to see them before they see us." The Silent Observer was specifically designed for covert operations, its hull constructed from metamaterials that absorbed sensor radiation rather than reflecting it. For 12 hours, they moved through the system like a ghost, cataloging everything they found. What they discovered changed everything. "Commander," Lieutenant Kexvor called urgently. "You need to see this." The main display showed what had once been the 3rd planet in the system, where a world should have been. They found instead a debris field stretching across millions of kilometers of space. But this wasn't the result of some ancient cosmic collision. The debris showed signs of recent bombardment, with metal fragments still glowing from the heat of whatever had destroyed them. Analysis indicates this planet was rendered uninhabitable approximately 6 standard days ago, the ship's science officer reported. The bombardment pattern suggests orbital weapons platforms designed for planetary sterilization. Commander Yildash felt a chill run through her nervous system. What could do this kind of damage? Based on the energy signatures, it would require a fleet of at least 50 heavy dreadnoughts firing continuously for several hours. But who would waste that much firepower on a single planet? The answer came from an unexpected source. As they moved deeper into the debris field, their sensors detected something that shouldn't have been there: active signals. "Multiple contacts," Lieutenant Kexvor reported with growing alarm. "Small craft, heavily armed, moving to intercept." "Human vessels?" Commander Yildash asked. "Unknown. Configuration doesn't match the ship that destroyed the Eternal Dominion. These appear to be different." On the tactical display, 12 small ships emerged from hiding places among the asteroid debris. But these weren't human vessels. Commander Yildash recognized the design immediately, and her blood froze. "Those are Devourers," she whispered. The Devourers were a legend whispered about in the darkest corners of galactic civilization. An ancient machine intelligence that consumed entire star systems, converting all organic and inorganic matter into more of themselves. They had been responsible for the extinction of over 30 known species before mysteriously disappearing from the galaxy 5,000 years ago. Now they were back. "Commander," Lieutenant Kexvor said urgently, "we're receiving a transmission from one of the human survivors." Survivors? The main screen flickered to life, showing the interior of what appeared to be a makeshift command center built into the hull of an asteroid. A human woman, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion, looked directly at them through the communication link. "Hegemony vessel. This is General Amanda Rodriguez, commanding officer of Earth Defense Force Remnant units. We need to talk." Commander Yildash stared at the human in disbelief. "General, what happened here?" "What happened," General Rodriguez said grimly, "is that Earth is gone, destroyed by those machine bastards 6 days ago, along with our entire home fleet and 4 billion people. What you're looking at is all that's left of humanity." The implications hit Commander Yil_Skordash like a physical blow. "The ship that destroyed our dreadnought. The Indomitable," General Rodriguez confirmed. Captain Chun and her crew were the last ship to escape Earth destruction. They were supposed to find a safe harbor for the survivors. Instead, they ran into your people. "But why attack us?" Commander Yildash asked. "We had no involvement in your planet's destruction." General Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Because when Captain Chun tried to request assistance, your admiral threatened to destroy her ship and board it for inspection. After what we'd been through, after watching our entire world burn, that wasn't a request we were willing to comply with." Commander Yildash began to understand the horrifying chain of events that had led to the current situation. The humans hadn't attacked the hegemony out of aggression or territorial expansion. They had lashed out in the desperate fury of a species that had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "General," she said carefully, "how many of your people survived?" "Including the civilians we managed to evacuate, about 12,000. spread across 15 ships, most of them damaged. We've been hiding in this asteroid field, trying to figure out what to do next. And the Devourers? Still active, still consuming everything they can find. They've already moved on to the next system, but they left behind hunter-killer units to clean up any survivors. General Rodriguez gestured toward the tactical display. Those 12 ships that are about to attack you, they're just the advanced scouts. Commander Yildash looked at her pilot, seeing her own growing horror reflected in his expression. If the Devourers were active again, if they were systematically consuming star systems, then the destruction of one hegemony dreadnought was the least of their problems. General, she said, we need to establish communication with our high command immediately. This information will be dismissed as the desperate lies of a hostile species, General Rodriguez interrupted. We know how galactic politics work. You'll waste months in committee meetings while the Devourers consume system after system. Then what do you suggest? General Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had made a terrible decision. We suggest you run. Get out of this sector, get as far away as you can, and warn everyone you can reach. Because what's coming next isn't interested in your politics or your territory or your trade routes. It just wants to consume everything in its path. Before Commander Yildash could respond, alarms began sounding throughout her ship. Multiple new contacts, Lieutenant Kexvor reported frantically. Massive energy signatures approaching from the outer system. The tactical display filled with new contact indicators. Not dozens of ships, but hundreds, thousands. An armada of Devourer vessels of every size and configuration, from small scout units to massive harvester ships the size of moons. How many? Commander Yildash whispered. Initial count suggests over 5,000 individual units, came the stunned reply. And more are still emerging from hyperspace. General Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos on the bridge. Hegemony vessel, get out of here now. Broadcast everything you've seen to your fleet command. Tell them what's coming. What about your people? We're staying. Someone has to slow them down, and we're already dead anyway. General Rodriguez managed a grim smile. Besides, we've gotten pretty good at taking impossible odds. Commander Yildash watched in fascination and horror as the surviving human ships began to move. Instead of trying to escape, they were positioning themselves between the silent observer and the approaching Devourer fleet. 12,000 survivors, most of them civilians, preparing to sacrifice themselves to buy time for a single hegemony scout ship to escape. General, this is madness. You can't possibly hold that fleet. No, General Rodriguez agreed, but we can hurt them. And maybe if we hurt them badly enough, we can buy you enough time to warn the galaxy about what's coming. The human ships opened fire first, their weapons blazing with the fury of a species that had nothing left to lose. They didn't use the surgical precision tactics of the Indomitable. Instead, they fought with pure, desperate aggression, ramming damaged ships into larger opponents, overloading reactors to create massive explosions, using every desperate tactic they could conceive. Commander Yildash watched the tactical display as 12,000 humans threw themselves against 5,000 Devourer ships in a battle that could have only one outcome. But the humans weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to ensure that word of the Devourer return reached the galaxy. Lieutenant, she said quietly, plot a course for the hyperspace limit. Maximum speed. Yes, Commander. As the silent observer accelerated toward the edge of the system, Commander Yildash kept the communication channel open, listening to the sounds of humanity's final battle. The humans fought for 18 hours, long enough for her ship to reach safe hyperspace distance, and transmit everything they had recorded to Hegemony Command. When the last human ship finally fell silent, Commander Yildash realized that her understanding of warfare had been fundamentally changed. The humans hadn't just been willing to die for their cause. They had been eager to ensure their deaths served a purpose. And now, racing back toward hegemony space with news that would shake the galaxy, she understood why the Indomitable had fought so fiercely against the Eternal Dominion. It hadn't been an attack on the hegemony. It had been a test. The humans had been learning whether galactic civilization was strong enough to stand against what was coming. Based on the hegemony's response to a single damaged ship, they had concluded the answer was no. Now the Devourers were loose in the galaxy again, and the only species that had shown the will to fight them to the bitter end had just sacrificed their last survivors to deliver a warning to the very people who had rejected them. Commander Yildash looked at the tactical data streaming back from the Kepler 442 system and realized that everything was about to change. The galaxy's greatest threat had returned, and the only people crazy enough to fight them were gone. Unless, she thought with growing hope, there were more humans out there. More ships that had escaped Earth's destruction. More survivors willing to make the hard choices that galactic civilization seemed incapable of making. Because if the Devourers were truly back, the galaxy was going to need all the help it could get from species that understood the mathematics of acceptable losses. Even if those species terrified everyone else almost as much as the enemy they were fighting. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the neutral space of Station Harmony, a massive diplomatic complex that had served as the center of interspecies relations for over a millennium. Representatives from 43 different civilizations gathered in the Great Assembly Hall, their various forms of communication creating a complex symphony of sounds, lights, and pheromone releases. Admiral Kalmek stood at the central podium, his massive frame dwarfing the speaking platform as he addressed the assembled delegates. The tactical hologram floating above his head showed the spread of Devourer activity across 17 star systems, each red indicator representing a world that had gone silent in the past 10 days. Honored representatives, Admiral Kalmek began, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. We face a threat unlike anything our civilizations have encountered in recorded history. The Devourers have returned, and they're consuming entire systems at an unprecedented rate. Counselor Velthane, representing the hegemony's interests, activated her speaking privileges. The data we've gathered from our scout missions confirms our worst fears. These are not the same Devourers our ancestors faced 5 millennia ago. They have evolved, become more efficient, more coordinated. Their consumption rate has increased by a factor of 12. A wave of concerned communications swept through the assembly hall as delegates processed this information. Ambassador Kithrix of the Centauri Federation, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns, rose to address the assembly. Admiral Kalmek, what response do you recommend? Surely our combined fleets can mount an effective defense. Admiral Kalmek's mandibles clicked together grimly. Ambassador, we have attempted 3 coordinated fleet actions against Devourer formations. In each case, our forces were overwhelmed within hours. They adapt to our tactics faster than we can implement them. Traditional warfare appears to be ineffective. Then, what alternative do we have? Demanded General Morthak of the Rigel Defense Consortium, his reptilian features showing the strain of recent defeats. Before Admiral Kalmek could respond, the chamber's attention was drawn to an unexpected arrival. The main entrance dilated to admit a figure that caused a collective intake of breath from the assembled delegates. A human. The woman who entered wore the tattered remains of what had once been a military uniform, her left arm clearly artificial, her face scarred from recent battles. She walked with the measured pace of someone who had endured more than most beings could imagine, and somehow continued functioning. My apologies for the interruption, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. I am Colonel Lisa Park, United Earth Defense Force. I believe you've been looking for us. The assembly erupted in a cacophony of surprise communications before Counselor Velthane restored order. Colonel Park, we were told that humanity was extinct. Reports of our extinction were greatly exaggerated. Colonel Park replied with a grim smile. Though not by much. We lost Earth and most of our fleet, but several 100,000 survivors made it out in colony ships and deep space vessels. Admiral Kalmek leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing intently on the human officer. Colonel, our intelligence indicates that your people have had success against Devourer forces. We need to understand how. Colonel Park moved to the center of the chamber, accepting the speaking platform with an ease that suggested familiarity with command situations. Admiral, your intelligence is correct, but probably not for the reasons you think. We haven't been successful because we have superior weapons or better tactics. We've been successful because we're willing to accept casualty rates that apparently terrify everyone else. Explain, Ambassador Kithrix requested, her crystalline structure flickering with interest. Every engagement we've had with the Devourers has been a calculated trade. Colonel Park said matter-of-factly. We lose ships, they lose ships, but we make sure they lose more than they can afford. The mathematics are simple. They need resources to replicate. We deny them those resources even if it costs us everything we have. General Morthak's scales rippled with discomfort. You're talking about suicide tactics. I'm talking about acceptable losses, Colonel Park corrected. Every human ship that makes it out of Earth's destruction knows they're already dead. We lost our homes, our families, our entire civilization. What we have left is the opportunity to make our deaths count for something. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Admiral Kalmek was the first to speak. Colonel, how many human vessels survived Earth's destruction? We estimate about 300 ships of various types scattered across this sector of the galaxy. Most are colony vessels, cargo haulers, and research ships that were never designed for combat. We've been modifying them as best we can. 300 ships against thousands of Devourer vessels, Counselor Velthane observed. The mathematical odds are irrelevant, Colonel Park interrupted. We're not trying to win a conventional war. We're trying to make continuing their advance too costly to sustain. Every system they want, we make them pay for with losses they can't easily replace. Ambassador Kithrix's crystalline form shifted into a pattern that indicated deep consideration. Colonel Park, are you suggesting that your people would be willing to coordinate with our fleets? I'm suggesting that your fleets need to learn to fight the way we do, Colonel Park replied. The Devourers adapt to traditional tactics because traditional tactics are based on preserving your own forces while minimizing enemy strength. We use tactics based on maximizing enemy losses while accepting our own destruction as inevitable. Admiral Kalmek studied the tactical hologram again, seeing the familiar patterns of fleet movements and defensive positions with new understanding. You're saying we need to abandon conventional strategic doctrine entirely. I'm saying you need to stop fighting like you want to live through this, Colonel Park said bluntly. The Devourers count on self-preservation instincts to make your tactics predictable. When you remove self-preservation from the equation, their adaptation protocols become much less effective. The assembly buzzed with uncomfortable communications as delegates processed this radical proposition. General Morthak voiced what many were thinking. Colonel, what you're describing isn't military strategy. It's organized self-destruction. General, Colonel Park replied, look at your tactical displays. Look at 17 dead systems and thousands of destroyed ships. Your conventional strategies are organized self-destruction. We're just being honest about it. Counselor Velthane activated her speaking privileges again. Colonel Park, assuming some of our civilizations were willing to adopt these unconventional tactics, what would you recommend? Colonel Park gestured toward the holographic display, and the tactical projection shifted to show the current positions of both Allied and Devourer forces. First, stop trying to hold territory. The Devourers want resources, not strategic positions. Focus on denying them access to raw materials, even if it means destroying valuable installations. You're talking about scorched earth tactics on a galactic scale, Admiral Kalmek observed. Exactly. Second, abandon large fleet formations. The Devourers adapt faster when they can observe coordinated tactics. Use small, independent units that can strike without warning and disappear before they can be analyzed. Ambassador Kithrix's light patterns shifted to indicate concern. Such tactics would require ship crews willing to accept extremely high casualty rates. Which brings us to the third point, Colonel Park continued. You need volunteers, not conscripts. People who understand the stakes and are willing to make the necessary sacrifices. That means explaining to your populations exactly what we're facing and what it will cost to stop it. The chamber fell into a long silence as delegates considered the implications. What Colonel Park was proposing would require fundamental changes to how galactic civilization approached warfare, changes that would be difficult for most species to accept. Finally, Admiral Kalmek spoke. Colonel, assuming we could implement these tactical changes, what are the chances of success? Define success, Colonel Park replied. If success means defeating the Devourers completely and returning to the status quo, the chances are approximately 0. But if success means making their expansion so costly that they eventually move on to easier prey in another galaxy, we have a fighting chance. At what cost? Counselor Velthane asked. Everything, Colonel Park said simply. It will cost us everything we have and everything we are. But that's the price of ensuring something survives. Admiral Kalmak looked around the assembly hall, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the various forms of communication from the different species representatives. Colonel, you're asking us to fundamentally change the nature of our civilizations. No, I admitted. The Devourers are doing that. I'm asking you to change fast enough to have some control over what you become. The debate that followed lasted for 18 hours, with delegates arguing about tactical doctrine, casualty acceptance, and the moral implications of adopting what many called human-style warfare. In the end, the vote was closer than anyone expected. 23 civilizations agreed to coordinate with human survivors in implementing the new tactical doctrine, while 20 voted to pursue conventional defensive strategies. As the assembly dispersed, Admiral Kalmek approached Colonel Park privately. Colonel, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, Admiral. How do you live with the knowledge that you're asking people to die? Colonel Park was quiet for a moment before answering. Admiral, I'm not asking people to die. I'm asking them to make their deaths serve a purpose. There's a difference, and it's the only thing that's kept me functional since Earth burned. And you believe this approach can work? I believe it's the only approach that hasn't failed yet, Colonel Park replied, which makes it our best option. As Admiral Connor Scormack watched the human officer leave the chamber, he realized that everything about galactic warfare was about to change. The question wasn't whether they could adopt human tactics, but whether they could adopt human psychology. Because in the end, defeating the Devourers would require more than new weapons or better strategies. It would require beings willing to embrace the mathematics of mutual destruction. And across the galaxy, in hidden bases and secret communications networks, word was spreading that such beings existed. The humans were back, and they were teaching anyone willing to listen how to turn desperation into a weapon. The Alliance was forming, ship by ship, crew by crew, one volunteer at a time. 6 months after the formation of the Alliance of Last Resort, as history would later name it, the final battle for galactic civilization began in the Proxima Centauri system. The Devourers had consumed 47 star systems and were approaching the core worlds of galactic civilization when Alliance forces made their stand. Admiral Sarah Chun, younger sister of the captain who had destroyed the Eternal Dominion, stood on the bridge of the converted cargo hauler Never Surrender and watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. Around her, the combined remnants of 23 different civilizations had assembled the largest fleet in galactic history. But, more importantly, they had assembled the first fleet in galactic history that was not designed to survive the battle it was about to fight. Admiral, reported her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Vextau, a former hegemony fleet officer who had volunteered for the Alliance after his homeworld was consumed. Final count shows 12,000 Allied vessels of all classes. And Devourer strength? Admiral Chen asked. Estimated at over 30,000 individual units, including 17 harvester ships capable of consuming entire planets. Admiral Chen nodded calmly. The odds were worse than they had faced at any point in the war, which meant they were exactly what her tactical doctrine required. When fighting an enemy that adapted to your strategies, the key was to use strategies so insane that adaptation was impossible. Communications. Open a channel to all Allied vessels, she ordered. Across 12,000 ships, beings from 24 different species listened as the human admiral addressed them for what would be the last time. Allied forces, this is Admiral Chun. In approximately 30 minutes, we will engage the largest Devourer fleet ever assembled in known galactic history. Our intelligence indicates that this represents the core of their invasion force. If we can stop them here, we can break their advance permanently. She paused, looking around at her own bridge crew, an impossible mixture of humans, hegemonites, Centaurians, and a dozen other species who had learned to work together in ways their governments never could. I won't lie to you about our chances. We are outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy that has never been defeated in open battle. By all conventional military wisdom, we should retreat and attempt to preserve our forces for a more favorable engagement. Admiral Chen smiled grimly. Fortunately, we stopped using conventional military wisdom 6 months ago. Across the fleet, crews prepared for battle with a mixture of determination, and acceptance that would have been impossible before humanity taught the galaxy the mathematics of acceptable losses. Weapons were charged not for sustained engagement, but for maximum single-shot damage. Reactors were prepared for deliberate overload. Ships were positioned not for mutual support, but for maximum individual impact. The Devourers expect us to fight for survival, Admiral Chen continued. Instead, we will fight for cost-effectiveness. Every ship that dies today will take at least 3 enemy vessels with it. Every life lost will ensure that 10 more survive somewhere else. This is not a battle for victory. This is a battle to prove that some things are too expensive to be worth having. On the tactical display, the Devourer fleet appeared at the edge of the system like a plague of metal locusts. 17 massive harvester ships, each the size of a small moon, surrounded by thousands of smaller vessels designed for consumption and conversion of raw materials. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Vextal reported, they're beginning their approach. Standard formation, harvester ships protected by screening elements. Exactly as we expected, Admiral Chen said with satisfaction. They're still thinking like a conventional fleet. All units, execute Protocol Omega. Protocol Omega was the Alliance's most radical tactical innovation, based entirely on human concepts of acceptable losses. Instead of meeting the enemy fleet with organized formations, the Allied vessels scattered into thousands of individual attack vectors, each ship pursuing its own target without regard for coordination or mutual support. To conventional military observers, it looked like the complete breakdown of fleet discipline. To the Devourer's adaptation algorithms, it was impossible to analyze because there was no pattern to adapt to. The battle began with a coordinated ramming attack by 200 volunteer vessels against the enemy's leading formations. These ships had been modified specifically for maximum kinetic impact. Their crews sealed into reinforced command centers as their vessels became guided missiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed. The Devourer screening forces designed to intercept and neutralize conventional weapons found themselves facing an enemy that treated starships as ammunition. Their point defense systems, optimized for stopping energy weapons and guided missiles, were overwhelmed by the simple physics of large masses moving at relativistic velocities. First wave impact successful, Lieutenant Commander Vextal reported as the tactical display showed the destruction of nearly 1,000 enemy vessels. Devourer formations are breaking up to avoid further ramming attacks. Excellent, Admiral Chen said. Now they're thinking defensively. All remaining units, begin Phase 2. Phase 2 was even more radical than the opening attack. Alliance vessels began systematically overloading their reactors, creating artificial supernovas at carefully calculated points throughout the Devourer fleet. Each explosion consumed the Allied vessel that created it, along with everything within several thousand kilometers. The Devourers found themselves facing an enemy that used the fundamental forces of physics as weapons, turning their own ships into stars for brief, devastating moments. Their adaptation protocols, designed to counter technological threats, had no framework for dealing with enemies that weaponized self-destruction on this scale. Admiral, came an urgent transmission from Captain Rex Voidheart, whose pirate fleet had volunteered for the Alliance after seeing what the Devourers had done to independent colonies. Were breaking through their outer perimeter. Request permission to engage the Harvester ships directly. Granted, Captain. All units, focus on the Harvesters. Remember, we only need to damage them enough to force withdrawal. What followed was the most brutal engagement in recorded galactic history. Alliance forces threw themselves at the massive Harvester ships with complete disregard for survival, using tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Ships rammed into critical systems. Reactors were deliberately overloaded inside enemy hulls. Crews spacewalked through hull breaches to plant explosives by hand. The Devourers adapted as fast as they could, modifying their defenses and changing their formations, but they could not adapt fast enough to counter an enemy that constantly invented new ways to die effectively. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Vextal called urgently. We're receiving a priority transmission from the Hegemony homeworld. Put it through. The familiar image of Fleet Admiral Kalmek appeared on the main screen, his compound eyes showing a mixture of awe and horror as he observed the battle through long-range sensors. Admiral Chun, this is Admiral Kalmek. Our strategic command is requesting an immediate assessment of the tactical situation. The situation is proceeding according to plan, Admiral, Chen replied calmly as explosions bloomed around her ship. We are successfully implementing a cost-exchange ratio that the enemy cannot sustain. Admiral, you've lost over 8,000 vessels in the past 2 hours. Yes, Admiral. And the enemy has lost over 24,000. The mathematics are working in our favor. Admiral Kalmek was silent for a moment before responding. Admiral Chun, what you're doing, this isn't warfare as we understand it. No, Admiral, it's not. It's warfare as we understand it. And for the first time in this war, it's working. The battle raged for 18 hours, with Alliance forces maintaining their tactical doctrine even as their numbers dwindled. But the mathematics that Admiral Chun had promised were indeed working. For every Allied ship destroyed, an average of 3.2 enemy vessels were eliminated. The Devourers, for the first time in their recorded history, found themselves facing an unacceptable exchange ratio. The turning point came when the last Alliance vessels, fewer than 200 ships from the original 12,000, concentrated their remaining forces against the damaged Harvester ships. Instead of trying to destroy them outright, they focused on damaging the ship's consumption and conversion systems. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Vextau reported, his voice hoarse from hours of continuous combat coordination. The Harvesters are withdrawing. All 17 ships are moving toward the hyperspace limit. Admiral Chun allowed herself a moment of exhaustion before responding. All remaining units pursue and harass, but do not attempt to prevent their withdrawal. We want them to leave, not fight to the death. As the Devourer fleet limped away from the Proxima Centauri system, battered and reduced by over 70%, Admiral Chen realized they had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had fought a technologically superior enemy to a standstill using nothing but mathematics, determination, and a willingness to accept the unacceptable. Admiral, came a transmission from one of the surviving Allied vessels. This is Captain Park commanding the Last Hope. We're picking up long-range communications from the Devourer fleet. What kind of communications, Captain? They appear to be reassessing their strategic objectives, Admiral. Our translation algorithms suggest they're discussing the cost-effectiveness of continuing operations in this galaxy. Admiral Chen smiled for the first time in 6 months. Patch me through to Admiral Kalmek. When the connection was established, she addressed the Hegemony Commander directly. Admiral Kalmek, please inform the Galactic Council that the immediate threat has been neutralized. The Devourers are withdrawing from our galaxy. Admiral Chun, our long-range sensors confirm the enemy fleet is moving toward the galactic rim. But, Admiral, the cost. The cost was acceptable, Admiral, Chen replied firmly. 193 ships and approximately 40,000 volunteers bought the survival of galactic civilization. History will remember that trade as a bargain. In the weeks that followed, as the galaxy slowly came to terms with what had happened at Proxima Centauri, the story of the Alliance's final battle spread throughout civilized space. The humans and their allies had proven that even the most overwhelming enemy could be defeated if you were willing to pay the right price. More importantly, they had proven that some prices were worth paying. The Devourers never returned to the galaxy. According to long-range astronomical observations, they eventually moved on to neighboring galaxies where the inhabitants had not yet learned the mathematics of mutual assured destruction. Galactic civilization survived, forever changed by the knowledge that sometimes the only way to win was to be willing to lose everything. And in the rebuilt cities of a dozen worlds, monuments were erected to the Alliance of Last Resort, bearing a simple inscription that became the unofficial motto of the new galactic order. Acceptable losses, making the unacceptable too expensive to afford. Admiral Sarah Chun, one of only 1,200 Alliance personnel to survive the final battle, retired to a small colony world where she spent her remaining years teaching tactical philosophy to military officers from across the galaxy. Her most famous lecture, delivered annually at the Galactic Military Academy, always ended with the same words. The question is not whether you are willing to die for your cause. The question is whether you are willing to make your death so expensive that your enemy cannot afford it. Learn that mathematics, and you will never lose a war that truly matters. And across the galaxy, on ships bearing the names of the fallen, Crews from dozens of different species carried on the tradition of making victory too costly for any enemy to contemplate. Because sometimes the greatest victory is teaching your enemies to choose defeat.